Think about the last time someone told you something that contradicted how you see yourself. Maybe someone said you were being selfish when you believed you were being principled. Maybe a colleague said you seemed distant when you considered yourself someone who gives people space. Maybe a friend told you that you come across as arrogant when you have always thought of yourself as confident. How did you respond internally in that moment? Did you examine the feedback and seriously consider whether it might be accurate? Or did you look for the specific flaw in the person who said it, or in the timing, or in the phrasing, or in their most likely motive? Anything that would allow you to set the information aside? The answer to that question reveals something more important than whether you are selfish, distant, or arrogant. It reveals how your brain handles evidence that threatens the story it has built about who you are. That process has a name. It is called the confirmation bias. And when it is applied not to politics or sports or news, but to the self-concept, to the image of who you are, what you are capable of, and what kind of person you have become, it operates with a precision and a loyalty that has no real parallel anywhere else in cognition. The confirmation bias applied to the self is one of the most consequential and least examined forces in any person's life. The confirmation bias was first described systematically by the psychologist Wason in 1960, through a series of experiments showing that people naturally seek information that confirms their existing hypotheses rather than information that could falsify them. In one famous task, participants were shown the sequence 2, 4, 6, and asked to discover the underlying rule. They could test hypotheses by proposing their own number sequences, and Wason would tell them whether each proposed sequence fit the rule. The rule was actually very simple. Any ascending sequence of 3 numbers, which the brain often mistakes for being healthy. But a self-concept protected from contradiction is not a stable one. It is a rigid one. And rigidity in the self-concept has specific and well-documented consequences. Research by Carol Dweck at Stanford distinguishes between people who hold a fixed self-concept, who believe their qualities are essentially stable and given, and those who hold a growth mindset, who believe their qualities are developed through experience and effort. The fixed self-concept is not just less adaptive. It is also considerably more fragile. People with fixed self-concepts respond to failure not by updating their strategy, but by protecting their identity. They avoid challenges that might produce evidence of limitation. They dismiss feedback that does not fit the story. They stop in exactly the places where continuing would require them to see themselves differently. The confirmation bias operating on a fixed self-concept is not a minor or ultimately harmless cognitive quirk. It is a mechanism that can quietly limit the entire arc of a person's development. There's a specific version of this process that is especially difficult to see from the inside. Psychologists call it motivated reasoning. Unlike simple confirmation bias, which involves preferentially seeking confirming evidence, motivated reasoning involves actively constructing arguments against disconfirming evidence once it has already arrived. When someone tells you something unflattering, and your mind immediately generates 3 counterarguments without your consciously deciding to defend yourself. That is motivated reasoning. The counterarguments arrive quickly and feel entirely like rational analysis. They feel like careful consideration. They feel like you're being fair to yourself, weighing the evidence thoughtfully, not dismissing the feedback arbitrarily. But what is actually happening is that your vast majority of participants generated only sequences that confirmed their initial guess, even as that guess became increasingly elaborate and specific. They were not actually testing their hypothesis. They were gathering evidence for it. This tendency, Wason concluded, was not a failure of intelligence or education. It was a structural feature of the way human cognition works under conditions of uncertainty. And it becomes something far more powerful and consequential when the hypothesis being protected is not a number sequence, but a self-concept. Here's why the self-concept is uniquely vulnerable to this bias. Ordinary confirmation bias operates on beliefs about the external world. This stock will rise, this candidate will win, this treatment will work. Those beliefs can, at least in principle, be falsified by external reality. And when reality disagrees loudly enough, The belief sometimes updates. But the self-concept is different. It is a theory not about the world, but about the observer. It is a theory about you, about your intelligence, your generosity, your integrity, your competence, your emotional health. And because you're the primary source of information about yourself, you have enormous control over which data enters the record and which data gets silently discarded. You know when you were generous, but nobody noticed. You remember the moment of insight, but forget the 10 times you missed the point. You interpret ambiguous feedback in your favor and attribute clear negative feedback to someone else's limitations or their bad day. The self-concept is not passively observed. It is actively constructed, and confirmation bias is the mechanism doing most of the construction, quietly selecting the materials and discarding the rest. The psychological cost of this process is not obvious at first. A self-concept that is consistently protected from contradiction feels stable, which feels comfortable. Brain has identified a threat to a valued belief about the self and mobilized its reasoning capacity in service of protecting that belief rather than evaluating it. The reasoning is real. The conclusion was selected before the reasoning began. What allows any of this to shift is not more self-criticism. Research by Kristin Neff at the University of Texas and others working in the field of self-compassion consistently shows that people who are harshest on themselves in the wake of failure are often also the most defensive against feedback that could improve their performance. The harshness and the defensiveness look different from the outside, but they are two sides of the same psychological coin. Both are protecting the self-concept from information that feels threatening. What actually allows the self-concept to become more accurate, to update, to grow, to see itself with the clarity that real self-knowledge requires, is the capacity to receive information about the self without treating it as an attack on the self. To hold the feedback with enough distance and enough stability to ask, is there something true here? Not whether the person who said it was entirely fair or entirely correct or in the right emotional state to deliver it, but whether, underneath the delivery, there's something worth examining. That question is considerably harder than it sounds. The confirmation bias protecting your self-concept has been running since childhood, selecting evidence, shaping interpretation, interpreting ambiguity, and constructing a story that is consistent and coherent and, in many places, quietly wrong. Seeing that story for what it is, not as a threat, but as a draft, is where actual self-knowledge begins.